So for this video, we're going to talk about rounding. And rounding is really difficult because a lot of us have been taught rounding by just a set of rules. And the rules are good and the rules are important. But for kids, it's really hard to remember these rules. And especially remembering these rules from grade level to grade level can be difficult. So this is going to be about how we are teaching the students in third grade to round, so that hopefully they might remember those rules later because they have a second method for figuring out the answer as well. So when we first started teaching rounding, we didn't start with the rules immediately. First, we just started with showing it on a number line and practicing on a number line. So if I was going to round, let's say, 768 to the nearest 10, then I would have 780 and 790 as my benchmark numbers. And so I have to decide which one is 780 closer to. And so the way that we would do that is we would put a midpoint. And our midpoint would be the number that's exactly halfway in the middle. So we know we're going up 10. So we know that half of 10 is what we would need to add to 780. So we would have 785. Now, once we have the midpoint, we can tell what side 788 goes on. And if it's on this side, it's closer to 790. But if it's on this side, it's closer to 780. So let's go and compare the numbers. So the way that we compared numbers in place value is we would put these numbers in a place value house. So I'm going to use a pen because it'll be easier to draw in between this marker. So we have our hundreds, our tens, and our ones. Hundreds, tens, hard to see, but it's there, ones. So we can see in the hundreds, it's the same in the hundreds. We can see in the tens, it's the same in the tens. And when we get to the ones, we can see that it's different. And so we can see that this number is bigger. So we know that 788 is greater than 785. So it's on this side of the number line. And because 788 is right here, we can see it's closer to 790. Now, that's how we taught rounding initially. And there are some struggles with it. Students really struggle with trying to find their benchmark numbers. So I'm going to do another one, and we're going to talk about some of the skills that we've talked about for finding these numbers on the end. So let's say now we're going to do 629 to the nearest. We'll go to the nearest 10, and I'm going to do nearest with an N, 10, and I'm going to draw my number line. And now I've got to find my benchmark numbers. And so what I've told my students is if they put their number in a place value house, hundreds, tens, and ones, when you're rounding to the nearest 10, that tells you that this is the number that you're focusing on. And so everything after that number, when you actually round, is going to a 0. So when you rewrite this number, it's going to be a 0 because we don't care about the ones. We're trying to simplify the problem. That's the whole thing about rounding, is that we're trying to find something that's easier to work with. So this is going to become a 0. So my first option is just to leave it the way it is and go down, and we're just losing our ones. So we would have 620, or we could go up 110 to 630, and then we would find our midpoint, which is going to be half of 10 added to 620, so that'd be 625. And then we can see that if we compare the hundreds and the tens and then the ones, this number is greater because it has more ones still. So it goes on this side, so it's closer to 630 because our dot is right there. So we can see 629 is much closer. And sometimes kids get confused about the midpoint. They're like, oh, but is it closer to the midpoint? We focus on our benchmark numbers, and our benchmark numbers, remember, are never going to have, they're a simplified number, and this is not simplified. That's got all of its digits still in there, where these numbers, we've simplified the ones place to a 0. So that's how I would teach rounding to the tens, and then I would do something similar for rounding to the hundreds. So let's say let's have 629 again, but this time we're rounding to the nearest 100, Write it that way, nearest 100. And so I would have my number line, and then I put my benchmark numbers on it. And so we can see here that we have our hundreds, our tens, and our ones. And the rule is, since we care about the hundreds, everything past the hundreds would be simplified to a 0, so the number is easier to work with. So we can see here that our number is going to be 600, and if we go up 100, because we're going to the nearest 100, we know it's going to be 700. And then the midpoint is going to be half of 100. So half of 100 is 50. And we know that because in 100, there are 10 tens. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And if we look at half of those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because half of 10 is 5, we can see that that's 10 fives. No, 5 tens. Yeah, sorry, 5 tens. And so that would be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So we know that we can add 50 to this number to get our midpoint. So that'd be 650. And so now we can compare our numbers. So let me put this in a place value house. Hundreds, tens, ones, and we can see that the hundreds are tied, but the tens are not. And so we know that this 10 is greater, so we know that 629 is less than 650. So it goes on this side, 629, and that it's then closer to 600. So that's the general initial practice that we were using. And then once we've been practicing this a little bit and they're kind of getting a sense for it, then I introduced the rounding rules in tandem with this practice. So here's how I introduced the rounding rules. Let's look at the nearest 10 first. So I have some problems that are already ready. So right here, we can see this is the number we're rounding. And so I'm going to quickly go through and place these. So we can see that we have 582. And so we have our hundreds, our tens, our ones. We can see that we are, hold on, let me put this in a place values. Hundreds, tens, ones. We can see that the hundreds are tied, the tens are tied, and the ones are different. So we know that we're looking at the ones place to see which side the number is going on when we're rounding to the nearest 10. So I can see that I have to go on this side to round to the nearest 10. So I know that that's where 582 is going to go. So it's closer to this number. And to decide that, I had to look at the ones place. So let's do another one. We can see if we put them in a place value house. I'm not going to draw the letters above them because I want to save time. But we can see here that they're tied in the hundreds, they're tied in the tens, but they're not tied in the ones. And we can see that this number is bigger. But once again, we're looking at the ones. So we can see since this has more ones, it's greater than 575. So that means we're closer to 580. Now let's do one more because it doesn't matter. Even if you're looking at just tens, tens, ones, tens, ones, it's a smaller number. They're tied in the tens, but they're not tied in the ones. And so then the generalization is that when you're rounding to the nearest 10, all you need to do is you look at the ones to decide if you're going to have to round up or round down. And then we talked about how if you look at the ones place in all of these numbers, it's always going to be a 5. So when we're rounding to the nearest 10, we look at the ones place, and we know that if we were to draw a midpoint, we could see that the ones place is always going to have a 5 every single time, and that if we look at our ones places here, that if they are less than 5, you're going to round down and just lose your ones. Or if it's greater than 5, you're going to round up. And then here's another example. We can see here that if our number was greater than 5, we rounded up. If our number was less than 5 in the ones place, then you're going to round down. And so that was how we would first introduce the rules. And so we can see that when we're rounding to the nearest 10, you look at the ones place. If the ones place is greater than 5, you go up. If it's less than 5, you go down. But I'm always drawing it with the number line so that they can get a sense of why this rule is the way it is. Because the rule is assuming that you are imagining a midpoint on a number line. All right, now let's look at nearest hundreds. So once again, I'm going to go through and we're going to mark it and we're going to see what the generalization is. So we can see here that we've got 717. Put that in a place value house. Hundreds, tens, ones. So we can see that in this number right here, we have hundreds, tens, ones, that they are tied in the hundreds. They are not tied in the tens this time. So we can see that this number has more tens, and so this number is less than, so it goes on this side, so we're closer to 700. So in this one, we had to look at the tens place to decide. That's different from the nearest 10, because in the tens place, we had to look at the ones, and now we're looking at the tens place. So let's look at this one. Once again, we're still rounding to the nearest 100, even though it's a larger number, so we know we're still looking at this place value to see if it changes. Thousands, hundreds, tens, ones. Let me do this one in pen so I can really get in there. Thousands, hundreds, tens, ones. We can see they're tied in the thousands. We can see they're tied in the hundreds, but they're not tied in the tens. And so we can see that this 10 is greater, still looking at the tens place, just like we looked at the tens place here. And we can see that this one's greater, so it's going on this side. So we can see because it's greater than the midpoint, we are rounding to the rounding up. And then the same thing, here's a third example. So we can see hundreds, tens, ones, hundreds, tens, ones. We can see that we're tied in the hundreds. We're not tied in the tens. We can see that this 10 is greater, so we're still looking at the tens, and so we round up because this number has more tens than the midpoint. And so once again, as a class, this is something we had a conversation about, was that when you are rounding to the nearest 100, you look at the tens place to decide if your hundreds is going to change. And the reason we have to do that is because we can't look at the hundreds place, even though we're wanting to know if the hundreds place is what's going to change. The hundreds place for our midpoints are always going to be tied. So that's why we go to the tens place. So our midpoints for our tens are always going to have 5. They're always going to have 5. Just like when we're rounding to the nearest 10, our ones, our midpoints are always going to have 5. And so if they just imagine their midpoint, they can decide based on the typical rounding rules, are you going to round up or round down? So if our tens place is less than 5, you always know you're going to round down. And if our tens place is more than 5, you know you're going to round up. Same thing, once again, look at this 10 right here. It's greater than 5, so we know we're going to round up. And so now, after I've taught the rules, then I would just continue to teach the rounding rules of rounding up or down based on my number line. So then, once we've gotten all that, then I finally get to having a conversation about what happens when you have a number like this. Let's say I had the number 85, and I'm rounding to the nearest 10. So my benchmark numbers, I know I'm going to simplify this number. Since I'm rounding to the nearest 10, I know my ones are going to a 0, so I have the choice of 80 or the choice of 90 with a midpoint of 85. Now, look, my number is the same as 85. So when your number is exactly in the middle for rounding, you know that it's the gentleman's agreement in math that we are always going to go up. We are always going to round up even if we're exactly in the middle. And I like to focus that the midpoint, if you have a 5, even though you're going to round up, you're actually exactly in the middle, because in math we like to go bigger. We would prefer to have a larger estimation rather than a smaller one. So you always round up. Same thing for hundreds. If we had a number like 675, actually that wouldn't be a very good choice. Let's do 658, because now our hundreds, our tens, and our ones, let's draw our midpoint. So we've got 600, because after the hundreds place, everything's going to go to a 0 when you're rounding to the nearest hundred. And then you've got 700. And then our midpoint would be 650. And this is why I rewrote it for this number, because we can see now our tens are tied. So normally we would just look at the tens. But for this one, look, we have our ones right here. And so this is a little bit of a different example, because you can see right here that even though they're tied in the tens, we can go to the ones for this one and see that this number is greater. And so we would still round up. Now, if the number was, let's say, 650, and it was exactly the midpoint, hundreds, tens, ones, we could see that they're tied, they're tied, they're tied. It's exactly in the middle. So it would be the same thing we talked about here, where you would just round up because it's exactly in the middle, and that's the gentleman's agreement for math. We always want to estimate larger. So in summary, when it's in the midpoint, you round up for hundreds or tens. It doesn't make a difference between the two. And if we had a number like 658 where our tens were tied, we would go to our ones to decide. And if our ones couldn't tell us and we were exactly in the middle, you round up. So I would just, when you're working with your students, just make sure that you're helping them draw the number lines. And even though this might be difficult for them to do, it's something we're going to work on all year, and I promise they will get better and better at this. But this makes a lot of difference, and if you draw the number lines with the rounding rules, eventually it'll click, and it'll stick a lot better than it would if you were to just teach the rules in isolation.